The headline said an Iowa mob had tried to lynch a judge. At John Hanzel's Pennsylvania sale, horses and cows drew 5-cent bids. The entire sale brought $1.18. Neighbors returned everything. Falling prices had turned law-abiding neighbors into their own court. In Iowa, that power would move from the auction to the courthouse, put a rope around Judge Charles Bradley's neck, and push government toward a different answer to debt. How did 5-cent bids become a noose? The answer begins 45 miles away, earlier that same day. On the morning of April 27, 1933, farmers gathered at the O'Brien County Courthouse in Primghar, Iowa. They had come to stop a foreclosure sale. Deputy sheriffs were waiting with axe handles. When protesters tried to force their way up the courthouse steps, the deputies drove them back. The confrontation became a fight. Several farmers were injured. One of them was Morris Cope. Cope was a local hog producer, an inventive operator who would receive a patent that summer for a hog house door. He was not a mysterious revolutionary sent into Iowa. He belonged to the agricultural world the protest claimed to defend. He had helped organize highway blockades. He had argued for a march on the state capitol. At Primghar, he suffered a head injury serious enough to need medical attention. But the defeat did not send him home. Some of the protesters climbed into vehicles and drove southwest toward Le Mars. That movement, from one courthouse to another, is the spine of the day. The distance gave the anger time to travel. 45 miles is long enough for men to repeat what officers had done to them, compare injuries, turn defeat into grievance, and decide that the next official would not push them aside so easily. It is also short enough that the events belonged to one continuous afternoon. By about 5 o'clock, the confrontation had reached Bradley's courtroom. Contemporary reports disagree on whether the crowd numbered a little more than 100 or several times that. The exact number changed as people gathered, followed, and later remembered the event. What matters is the imbalance. There were enough men to make the ordinary authority of judge, sheriff, and courtroom staff irrelevant. The men arriving in Le Mars were not calm citizens beginning a new argument. At least part of the group had just fought officers over a foreclosure, lost, and been physically beaten back. They were angry, injured, and already practiced in trying to stop legal procedure through mass presence. At the Plymouth County Courthouse, Judge Charles C. Bradley was hearing arguments connected to Iowa's new debtor relief law and mortgage moratorium. The farmers wanted more than sympathy, they wanted a promise. Contemporary reporting described the demand directly. Bradley was to swear that he would not sign any more foreclosure actions. To understand why that demand could sound like justice to the crowd and impossible to the judge, we need to understand what one signature meant in Iowa farm country. For much of urban America, the Great Depression began with the stock market crash in October 1929. For Iowa farmers, the trouble had started nearly a decade earlier. The First World War had transformed American agriculture. Europe needed food. Prices rose. Land values climbed. A larger farm, a new tractor, or another team of horses could look less like a gamble than a rational investment in a world that would keep eating whatever Iowa could grow. Farmers borrowed against that future. Banks and insurance companies were willing to lend against land whose value appeared secure. Then the war ended. European production returned. Demand weakened. American farmers kept producing and prices fell. The land was still there. The mortgage was still there. But the crop's power to pay that mortgage was shrinking. A farmer could work the same acres, raise the same animals, and bring the same volume to market, yet become poorer. His debt was measured in dollars fixed during the boom. His income was measured in prices collapsing in the present. By the early 1930s, legal historians estimate that about half of Iowa's farmers had financed land through mortgage debt. In parts of the state, people spoke of 10-cent corn. That number was not merely a market quotation, it was a verdict on labor. Seed, feed, Machinery, taxes, interest, and family survival all had to come out of a crop the market said was barely worth moving. Plymouth County suffered its own sequence of blows. A bumper crop elsewhere could push prices down, while local heat, grasshoppers, or a destructive storm reduced what a family had to sell. In 1932, the county was declared a destitute area. The mortgage carried the optimism of the boom into the worst years of the bust. Interest arrived according to a calendar that did not care what corn brought at market. For a creditor, foreclosure was the remedy written into a contract. For a family, it was the conversion of years of work into somebody else's property. A missed payment became a notice became a hearing became an order became a sheriff's sale. Then land, livestock, tools, or household goods were placed before bidders. The law treated each step as a separate procedure. The family experienced them as one continuous removal. That is why a judge's signature mattered. Bradley had not written the mortgage. He did not control crop prices, the weather, the banks, or the legislature. But a court could transform a lender's paper claim into physical possession. The signature on an order connected two worlds: columns in a ledger and a sheriff standing at a gate. Iowa lawmakers knew ordinary procedure had become dangerous. In early 1933, the state adopted debtor relief measures intended to slow the process while families waited for recovery. But emergency law created new uncertainty. Creditors challenged delays to their contractual rights. Farmers feared relief written on paper would arrive after the sale. Judges had to decide what the new law allowed and whether it was constitutional. Every delay could save a family time. Every refusal could look like choosing the bank. Yet if Bradley promised never to sign another foreclosure action, he would not be interpreting the law. He would be announcing the outcome of future cases before hearing them. That was the collision inside his courtroom. The farmers saw a man who possessed the power to stop foreclosures. Bradley saw an office whose power existed only because a crowd could not dictate its next judgment. The atmosphere in the courtroom was hostile before anyone touched the judge. Accounts describe a dispute over hats and smoking. Bradley ordered men to remove their hats and stop smoking. The crowd refused. The detail sounds small. It was not. A courtroom turns conflict into procedure through rules everyone agrees to obey. Where people stand, when they speak, who decides, and how force is restrained. The refusal to observe those rules announced that Bradley's authority no longer controlled the room. Then came the demand: no more foreclosure actions. Both sides could claim they were defending democracy. The farmers could say that law existed to serve the people, and a courthouse paid for by their taxes should not become a machine for dispossessing them. Bradley could say that a court ceased to be a court if the largest crowd in the room could dictate its next judgment. One side measured legitimacy by economic survival, the other measured it by procedure. Under ordinary conditions, politics is supposed to mediate that disagreement. Legislators change the law, judges apply it. Voters replace the legislators. Appeals correct the judges. Foreclosure worked faster than that cycle. A family could be removed while a bill was debated or a constitutional question considered. The crowd had come to compress political time. Bradley would not let it compress judicial judgment. He refused the pledge. Farmers surged toward the bench. They pulled him down, slapped and shook him, and carried him bodily from the courtroom. They dragged him through the courthouse and onto the lawn. The violence crossed several visible thresholds. First, the crowd defied an instruction. Then it issued one. Then it treated refusal as permission to seize the person who had refused. Nobody needed to announce that the court was suspended. The sight of its judge being carried through the lobby made the fact obvious. Outside, the courthouse square offered another chance to stop. More people could see what was happening. The men could have left Bradley on the lawn and claimed they had demonstrated their anger. Instead, they demanded the pledge again. The room had been designed to make authority visible. The judge sat above the floor. Lawyers approached the bench. The sheriff could enforce order. For a few minutes on April 27th, none of it mattered. Bradley was no longer the figure above the room. He was one man inside a crowd. They demanded the pledge again. He refused again. Physically, the farmers controlled him. Institutionally, they still needed him to say yes. That was the limit of their power. They could remove the judge from the court, but they could not make his surrender look voluntary unless he spoke the words. So they put him in a truck. Before we follow that truck out of Le Mars, there is one more thing to understand. This was not the first time Iowa farmers had discovered that a disciplined crowd could overpower a financial procedure. The movement had practiced on the auction. At an ordinary auction, the price rises because bidders compete. Farmers discovered that the opposite could also be true. If a community arrived together, and if everyone understood what was expected, competition could disappear. A tractor, a team of horses, a wagon, or an entire farm might be sold for a nominal sum. A friendly bidder could then return the property to the family that had lost it. These became known as penny auctions. The phrase makes them sound playful. They were not. Imagine the sale from the family's point of view. Objects that had existed as parts of daily life were separated and assigned numbers. A plough was no longer the tool used in one field. It was a lot. A cow was no longer milk for the household and income for the farm. It was an asset. The auctioneer's voice translated a working system into pieces that could leave in different wagons. Then the neighbors arrived. The mechanism mattered more than the literal coin. Bidding remained deliberately low. A friendly buyer acquired the property. A deed, tool, or animal could then be handed back. In economic terms, the crowd destroyed price discovery. In moral terms, it refused to let a distressed sale pretend to measure the value of a family's life. At its most generous, the tactic was mutual aid. A community looked at the legal transfer of a neighbor's livelihood and refused to let the procedure produce its intended result. The bank might possess the note. The sheriff might possess the order, but the crowd possessed the room. That was the movement's great discovery. It also contained a danger. The tactic worked only if outside bidders remained silent. Sometimes silence came from shared conviction. Sometimes it came from the knowledge that hundreds of angry people were watching. A bidder who believed the sale should proceed had the law on his side. He might not have the crowd. The same collective power could therefore be described in two honest ways. It was solidarity. It was intimidation. Returning a family's tools was not the same act as putting a rope around a man's neck. But both depended on one lesson. When enough people act as one, formal authority can become strangely fragile. In 1932, the Farmers' Holiday Association carried that lesson from auctions to highways. Its leader, Milo Reno, urged farmers to stay home, buy nothing, sell nothing, and withhold produce until prices covered the cost of production. It was a strike built for people who did not have a factory gate. The road became the picket line. Around Sioux City and through neighboring farm country, protesters stopped trucks and tried to prevent milk, livestock, and other goods from reaching market. In Plymouth County, highway crowds could number in the hundreds and sometimes more than 1,000. The movement replaced shame with coordination. A foreclosure notice told one family it had failed. A blockade told hundreds of families the system had failed them. But collective leverage demanded obedience. A farmer who chose to ship during the strike was not making a private decision in the eyes of the pickets. He was weakening everyone else's position. Some protesters confronted drivers and non-cooperating farmers. Property was damaged. Shots were fired during the wider unrest. Officials made mass arrests. The formal movement had leaders and demands, yet the most militant local actions often ran ahead of them. Historians later found that Milo Reno and other prominent organizers neither planned nor accepted the violence that came to define the revolt. By the winter of 1932 into 1933, the fight moved from prices to possession. Farmers gathered at sheriff sales. They blocked evictions. They pressured creditors, attorneys, sheriffs, and judges. Many of the militants were not established landowners protecting deeds in their own names. Later research identified 56 local farmers or farm workers associated with the Plymouth County movement. Only 13 owned land in 1933. Others were renters, farmhands, or sons working with parents. They were fighting to preserve a future in which the family farm might one day become theirs. Foreclosure could erase an inheritance before it was inherited. Morris Cope represented that local militancy. He organized blockades, fought at Primghar, and arrived in Le Mars with a head wound and a history of direct action. The crowd that took Bradley was not performing an unfamiliar tactic. It was extending a familiar one. At a penny auction, the crowd controlled the price. On a highway, it controlled movement. In Bradley's courtroom, it tried to control the law. When the law still said no, the truck left town. Accounts vary on the exact size of the crowd and on some details of what followed. That is common when newspapers reconstruct a chaotic event from witnesses, wire reports, and later memories. The central sequence is not in doubt. Bradley was taken from the courthouse. He was driven out of Le Mars. He was blindfolded. And at a crossroads in the Iowa countryside, the crowd tried once more to make him promise. The details were ugly because they were meant to be. Bradley was smeared with grease or mud. His clothing was torn or removed. Contemporary reports say his trousers were taken. The crowd mocked him. Then someone produced a rope. It went around Bradley's neck. The Indianapolis Times printed those words the next day. Noose placed around neck. The Daily Iowan reported that the rope choked him until he was only partly conscious. Later accounts disagree over whether his body was briefly lifted, whether a second attempt was prepared, and whether the crowd intended an execution or a terrifying performance that had moved beyond anyone's control. There is no need to manufacture certainty. A rope pulled tight around a man's neck does not become harmless because some participants imagined they were staging a warning. A crowd can enter a scene with different intentions and still create one lethal outcome. Bradley was ordered again to promise that he would stop foreclosure actions. He still refused. The crowd had dragged him from his courtroom, struck him, blindfolded him, stripped and smeared him, and placed a noose around his neck. It still had not obtained the pledge. Bradley asked to pray. The exact words attached to that prayer changed in later retellings, so they should not be treated as a transcript. But witnesses remembered a man praying while the crowd confronted the possibility that its symbolic judge might become a dead one. Bradley collapsed or fainted. Years later, Rome Starzl, editor of the Le Mars Globe-Post, remembered warning the men that even if they did not intend to kill Bradley, the judge might die of a heart attack. Then they would be guilty of murder. In Starzl's recollection, that was the moment men began backing away. Starzl also remembered the scene as a grotesque kind of public theatre. Bradley was mocked like a false king. The details of that memory were recorded more than 2 decades later and cannot all be treated as a court transcript, but the interpretation helps explain the danger. Some men may have believed humiliation was the object and death was not. The rope allowed them to perform power over the judge while still imagining a boundary between threat and execution. The body beneath the rope did not recognize that boundary. Contemporary accounts support the broader sequence: Bradley's collapse, the crowd's dispersal, and his survival, but they cannot prove that one sentence alone stopped the attack. What can be seen is the reversal of momentum. Mob violence does not begin with a single mind. A crowd acquires one through motion. Each step makes the next easier. reject the courtroom rules, surround the bench, seize the judge, move him outside, put him in the truck, drive beyond the town, add humiliation, add rope. By the time someone asks where the sequence ends, everyone has already helped carry it forward. At the crossroads, the sequence reversed. Men moved toward their cars. The crowd dispersed. Bradley regained consciousness. He was helped into his clothes and returned toward Lamar's. The answer to the first question is therefore less satisfying than a single heroic intervention. Bradley's prayer and collapse forced the men to confront what they were doing. Starzl later believed his warning named the consequence at the decisive moment. The crowd's unity fractured before coercive theatre became a completed execution. Bradley survived without giving the promise. The farmers demonstrated their power without winning the thing they said they wanted. And the state answered force with force. Sheriff Ralph Rippey appealed to Governor Clyde Herring for help. Herring declared martial law in Plymouth County and sent the Iowa National Guard. The next day's front page placed the consequence above the cause. Troops rule Iowa County. Mob tries to lynch judge. Soldiers arrived in farm country. Civilian order had not merely been challenged in theory. A judge had been removed from his own courtroom and taken beyond the town by a crowd local authorities could not stop. Roads, arrests, and public gatherings now existed under military power. Men suspected of participating in the attack were detained. A temporary camp held prisoners. The county that had used mass presence to overwhelm an auction or a courtroom now faced an institution built around disciplined force. The front pages made Lamar's a national story. Reporters arrived to explain how an agricultural protest in a state associated with orderly farm life had produced martial law. The contrast made irresistible copy. Fields and courthouses, neighbors and soldiers, a mortgage dispute, and a noose. But publicity also simplified the movement. A photograph of troops or a headline about lynching could show the climax. It could not show the years in which falling prices, fixed debts, drought, insects, and repeated legal losses had made the climax imaginable. That gap between the visible event and the invisible pressure shaped the search for culprits. Officials looked for an explanation that made the violence easier to contain. Governor Herring blamed hoodlums from Sioux City. Investigators raised the possibility of communist influence or red backing. The language fit a national fear that rural anger might be organized by outsiders. Communist organizers had shown interest in Midwestern farm unrest. Laborers and packing house workers appeared in the wider regional protest. Ideas, organizers, and tactics crossed county lines. But the arrest evidence points toward a more uncomfortable conclusion. The 38 people arrested in Plymouth County were farm owners, renters, or farm hands. The overwhelming majority of identified participants in the broader local movement came from the county. The revolt was not pure, sealed, or politically simple. It was local. That fact does not excuse the attack. It explains why Iowa could not dismiss it as a foreign infection. The neighbor who would stand beside a family at an auction could also stand inside a crowd that no individual felt able to stop. Martial law changed the physical balance. It also ended the argument by removing it from civilian hands. The legal aftermath unfolded through arrests, guilty pleas, contempt findings, and assault convictions. Sources grouped the defendants and sentences differently. A contemporary June report described 6 farmers pleading guilty in connection with the attack. Martin Rosberg received the heaviest sentence in that group, 6 months in county jail with another sentence suspended. Later scholarship counted 12 convictions or citations arising from the Bradley assault. Morris Cope avoided arrest for more than 2 months. He eventually surrendered and was convicted on assault charges after testimony identified him as a leader in the attack. His punishment was described as the harshest imposed for illegal protest in Plymouth County. The cases left an imperfect record. Some relevant court files disappeared or could not later be located. Historians reconstructed the participant list from newspapers, surviving criminal records, land directories, and interviews. That limitation matters because the event was quickly turned into a symbol by nearly everyone who used it. For the state, it justified emergency force. For critics of the movement, it proved that direct action ended in lawlessness. For defenders of farm relief, it showed what political delay could produce. For the defendants, it was not a symbol. It was a sequence of individual charges, witnesses, jail terms, suspended sentences, and reputations carried back into small communities. The greater sentence fell on the movement. Milo Reno and other farm leaders condemned the violence. Farmers who sympathized with blocking a foreclosure could see that the image of a rope around a judge would define them nationally. In Plymouth County, martial law and the moral shock effectively ended the revolt. Yet violence also made the farm crisis impossible to ignore. During the first months of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, federal action arrived at a speed that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Emergency mortgage relief, new farm credit, agricultural legislation, and later, stronger bankruptcy protection. The names of those programs sound technical because policy had finally begun translating desperation back into procedure. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, the Farm Credit Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and later the Fraser-Lemke bankruptcy protections. That translation was the peaceful counterpart to what the crowd had demanded from Bradley. Instead of forcing one judge to promise an outcome, government changed the rules governing credit, time, production, and default. None of those measures can be credited to one mob or one county. The New Deal responded to a national emergency shaped by years of political pressure and economic collapse. But the revolt made the cost of delay visible. 10-cent corn was an abstraction in a market report. A foreclosed family was a local tragedy. Farmers fighting deputies on courthouse steps, a judge beneath a rope, and National Guard troops in Iowa were a crisis of government. The federal response carried compromises. Agricultural policy sought to raise prices partly by limiting production. Credit programs restructured obligations. Mortgage relief created time. Bankruptcy reform shifted the balance between debtors and creditors. These programs did not restore the old world or make every family whole. They expanded federal power and required rules, paperwork, and production controls that movement leaders like Reno opposed. The government finally treated farm survival as a national responsibility. It also replaced the movement's vision of farmer-controlled prices with a national bureaucracy. Troops could end the revolt. They could not make the mortgage payable. That required changing credit, bankruptcy, prices, and the terms under which families could remain on the land. The simplest version of this story offers ready-made heroes and villains. The farmers were desperate people fighting banks, or the farmers were a mob attacking the rule of law. Bradley was a courageous defender of judicial independence, or Bradley was the face of a court system removing families from their homes. Each sentence contains part of the truth. None is enough. Bradley did not create the collapse in farm prices, yet the legal system concentrated all of those forces at his bench. To a farmer watching another foreclosure move forward, the distinction between administering the law and causing the loss could feel meaningless. The crowd did not invent the debt crisis. Its members watched labor lose value while obligations remained fixed. They built mutual protection when ordinary remedies failed. At a penny auction, that protection could give a family back its tools. At Lamar's, the same assumption, that the crowd had the right to force the just result, removed every limit except the crowd's mood. And mood is not law. The front page from April 28th preserves the contradiction in two adjacent claims. Mob tries to lynch judge. refuses to give pledge against foreclosures. Bradley would not surrender the independence of his court. The farmers would not accept a law that seemed to make family survival subordinate to a signature. One side possessed legal authority without an immediate answer to desperation. The other possessed collective power without a reliable boundary. When institutions stop feeling legitimate, people do not become powerless. They build power elsewhere, in associations, strikes, boycotts, blockades, crowds, and acts of mutual aid. Sometimes that power is the only thing strong enough to make suffering visible. Its moral test comes when a person inside it says no. At an Iowa auction, a crowd used its strength to return property to a neighbor. At a country crossroads, a crowd used its strength to put a rope around a man who would not surrender his office. The debt crisis explains how they reached that road. It does not erase what they did there.